Good evening, and thank you very much for coming tonight on a kind of a coolish, rainy evening. It is my pleasure to announce the inauguration of the Emily and Ted McWhinney lecture series, which will happen every year. And a few words about Ted and Emily. Ted McWhinney was a member of Parliament for Quadra. He was a professor at Simon Fraser University. He was a man of many, many talents and many interests, from international law to political science to history. And I think he and Emily would have loved tonight's lecture as a way of beginning the entire series. It is also my pleasure to thank our co-sponsors, the SFU School of Resource and Environment Management and the Department of Archaeology. I won't hold you too long, and it is my pleasure to introduce Jane Polkingham, the Dean of Arts and Social Sciences at Simon Fraser.
So, welcome. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Simon Fraser University's Vancouver campus, situated on the unceded traditional territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. I'm also delighted to join you this evening on the occasion of the first annual Edward and Ted McWhinney Memorial Lecture, organized by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies. The center maintains an active academic and community outreach program in a variety of fields, and as such forms a part of SFU's engaged university strategic vision. Over the years, the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies has hosted a series of high-profile academic and leading professionals. These include, for example, Costa Gavras, the Academy Award-winning film director and producer, and most recently, Robert Fisk, award-winning Middle East correspondent for The Independent. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Michael Danti. Dr. Danti is our academic director of the American Schools of Oriental Research Cultural Heritage Initiatives. The school was established through a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of State in 2014. And Dr. Michael Danti is an archaeologist with over 25 years' experience directing archaeological programs in Syria, Iraq, and Iran. He's also a member of the faculty at Boston University and serves as a consulting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. In 2011, he was elected Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. And clearly, he is a very busy man. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Danti, who will be speaking to us about A Momentary Erasure of Millenia, the Cultural Heritage Crises in Syria and Iraq.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's very good to be here. It's always a very happy time coming to Vancouver, especially these days, and leaving the United States. As a State Department person, I can tell you, things have been a little bit odd the last 3 months, but we'll let that go for now. Anyway, a little bit about the project that I direct. In 2014, well, let's go back a little ways. In 1991, I started as an archaeologist working on the Euphrates River in Syria in the area of Raqqa. And I worked there until 2011. And I was one of the first American archaeologists to pull out after the violence started in Syria and canceled my 2011 field season. And it was a very unusual thing for me, having worked in the same village for a very long period of time. None of us knew what was going to happen, obviously. We knew that things were changing in Syria in the lead up to 2010, 2011, but I can't honestly tell you that I saw any of this coming. So my second home was Raqqa and Aleppo. I did not start excavating again for some time. I thought that everything would settle down. I then began working. I work on and off in Iran, but I began working in Iraqi Kurdistan in 2013 and began directing a State Department program to revitalize the College of Archaeology at Mosul University, working with Iraqi archaeologists to rebuild what was the #1 archaeology college in Iraq, and I was very happy to work with them from 2012 to 2014. So in 2014, I was excavating in Iraqi Kurdistan, trying to help my Syrian friends and colleagues as much as I possibly could, but I was in kind of a state of denial. And I was working in Iraqi Kurdistan when a group that eventually would call itself the so-called Islamic State, or Daesh, emerged. They were already in Mosul, but emerged from hiding and quickly took over that city and large parts of northern Iraq. And then we kept telling ourselves they wouldn't get much further, but then they took large parts of Syria as well. And it was utter chaos, and obviously the Mosul University Archaeology program turned into more of an effort to get Mosul University faculty out of Mosul before they were targeted for execution. So I was, at the same time, I had just accepted the directorship of this program. The American Schools of Oriental Research is the largest professional society in North America dedicated to Near Eastern archaeology. And after the mistakes of the invasion of Iraq, the last invasion by the US, they wanted to put together a program to deal with the cultural heritage situation on the ground in Syria. That very quickly became Syria and Iraq in 2014, right after we had implemented this project and I had accepted the directorship of it. We essentially gather information on the cultural heritage situation in Iraq and northern Syria for the US State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs and the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. So we use high-resolution satellite imagery, sources on the ground, and open-source information to try to put together timely and accurate information on what's going on. And we have been producing weekly reports for 31 months. And I can tell you that that is a tall order to do monitoring, reporting, and fact-finding on what is now definitely the worst cultural heritage crisis since the Second World War. And I will show you some of the statistics on that in these opening slides. We also implement a lot of projects, rescue, emergency types of projects in Syria and Iraq, and they will not be the topic of discussion today. I do occasionally do talks on that, but we worry sometimes in promoting what we do on the ground that we create targets of sites and people that work with us. And so often I don't talk about the good work that's being done by our organization, ASOR, CHI, and a lot of other groups. But there is a lot that is being done to prevent the looting and trafficking of antiquities. And we're doing what we can to try to stop the deliberate destruction of heritage places. Those are the two leading factors that are destroying the cultural patrimony of Syria and Iraq, as you'll see. If you're interested, you can see our reports in redacted form on our website. We do try to make as much information as possible available to the public. So just to try to give you some idea of what things looked like back in December, the last time we went through our database and did the numbers on our reporting. But as you can see, there have been at least over 1,300 major cultural heritage incidents in Syria and in northern Iraq since we started keeping count in July/August of 2014. I know that there are far more than these numbers that you see up here. So that's a lot of sites that have been impacted, obviously. In the last 15 months, 915 cultural heritage sites have been pretty heavily impacted. Now, when I say impacted, on a lot of a surprising percentage of cases, we're talking about the complete destruction of a cultural heritage site, not just damage. It's been bulldozed, it's been blown to pieces. So these numbers really hide the reality. The primary causes of damage at this point are intentional destructions of heritage places, which I'll discuss in some detail today. And then more recently, especially since October of last year, the use of military explosives primarily delivered by fixed-wing aircraft. And I'll show you some of the distributions of that destruction, maps, what have you, but you can get some idea of the areas of Syria on the left there and Iraq that have been heavily impacted recently. I don't expect you to sort of disambiguate, as we say at the State Department, all the different icons and colors, but you can see that northwestern Syria has suffered severe, severe damage. And then the area of Mosul in Iraq. In terms of the causes of damage, one of the things that we look at from week to week, quarter to quarter, are the types of incidents that we're picking up on in the satellite imagery that our sources on the ground are telling us about. These are all verified incidents. There's a lot of false information out there on what's going on in Iraq and Syria. A lot of finger pointing back and forth as to who's responsible for these incidents. So one of the things we realized very early on in our project is we weren't just gathering data for the State Department, but that we were actually databasing evidence that we hope will be used in trials to bring people to justice. we will see prosecutions for some of these crimes against humanity. The leading cause of cultural heritage damage, particularly again over the last 6 or 7 months, has been the use of military explosives, with a phenomenal number of incidents, and these are cultural sites. And I'll drill down into these numbers in a moment and give you some idea of the types of sites that are being targeted, but you will, I think, leave with some sense that this is fairly deliberate. This is not just the typical collateral damage in warfare. Then we have military activity, which is a bit of a misnomer, intentional destructions, 170 sites. Now, these are largely the work of the so-called Islamic State, and in most of these cases, these numbers, 170, is the total annihilation of a mosque, a church, or some major monument at an archaeological site. You've seen them on the news a lot. Then we have illegal excavation. That number is actually far larger. These are verified cases where we have multiple sources of information that there's been conflict-related looting at a site. Now, there was looting before the war in Syria and northern Iraq, but we're looking at this just unimaginable scale of looting of archaeological sites now in the region. I often refer to it as industrial scale, where entire archaeological mounds are being removed from the surface. Now, that in of itself is highly unfortunate. It's a massive loss of our scientific data on the world's earliest civilizations, writing systems, state-level societies, earliest plant and animal domestication. I could go on and on about the first to the cradle of civilization. But one of the more alarming points is that these antiquities are being sold to finance terrorism. And if not terrorism, sometimes organized crime, transnational criminal organizations are using antiquities to fund their operations, and they use antiquities and other cultural property for trade-based money laundering. So this is a very important part of the revenue stream that's driving the conflict, whether we're talking the Islamic State or any of the other belligerents. They're all involved in this, but by far the Islamic State is the worst culprit. And you can see some of the other causes of damage. Thank you. Now, we've been looking at the frequency of damage over time, and the simple point of this breaks it down. Archaeological sites, religious sites, and then total sites impacted is that yellow color on the right of each quarter of reporting. And as you can see, there has been an escalation, although I will point out that my research assistant has lumped 4 months into the most recent reporting period, and I will have this corrected soon. So it's not as much of an escalation in the most recent reporting period, but that level of damage has remained stable, so things are not getting better. There are fewer intentional destructions of heritage sites now, but the amount of military damage that we're seeing has gone up markedly over the last couple of quarters. When we look at the types of sites that are being targeted intentionally, these are sites that are being bulldozed or they're being blown up using explosives. You can see that with the site types, we see 77% of the sites that are targeted are religious sites or monuments. If you watch the news in the West, you would think that all that the Islamic State was doing was blowing up archaeological monuments or archaeological sites, but in reality, they are engaged in cultural cleansing. Their primary targets during battle, they will stop in the middle of battle to blow up mosques and churches while they're under fire. It's so important to them to engage in this cultural cleansing to send a message. So a large part of the damage, the archaeological sites and monuments have been hit fairly heavily, but obviously what's really distressing here is the number of religious sites and monuments that have been targeted. When we look at, this is the most up-to-date graph I have of the religious affiliations of those sites. You can see how many of them are the sites that are essentially the history of Islam. There are Islamic sites that are being targeted. Lots of Christian sites have also been deliberately targeted, but that number is not as bad as it sounds. In a lot of cases, this has been deliberate targeting, but it hasn't resulted in the complete destruction of a church or a monastery. The numbers that have to do with mosques on this intentional destruction usually entail the complete destruction of a Sufi shrine or a Sunni mosque. The Islamic State is a radical Salafist organization, and they target all Sufi and Shia heritage, Yazidi heritage, Alawi heritage. They also will target Sunni heritage when it is a shrine, when there's a mosque that has an above-ground tomb complex inside of it. They believe that those tombs become a site of intercession between a worshiper and God, and therefore they must be destroyed to prevent heresy. And this is really devastated. What we're seeing here is an erasure of cultural memory. the erasure of cultural diversity in Syria and northern Iraq. This is very deliberate, planned out sort of attack on multiculturalism. These are Islamic State destruction. 91% of the intentional destructions that we have documented to date have been the work of the Islamic State, and it is very, very easy to verify them because the Islamic State takes credit for them and they provide the evidence online. They are quite proud of their deliberate destructions of heritage sites, and they do all that they can to use them in their propaganda. They generally use videotapes and photographs of deliberate destructions as a kind of clickbait online to try to up the number of people visiting their social media. This is done for recruiting purposes, but also a way to drive their propaganda, their radical Salafist ideology. And then you see a breakdown of the other 9%. Now, much of this is retributory violence. This is the sectarian nature of the conflict, a very deeply rooted sectarian conflict. And so we do see deliberate destructions by all the belligerents involved, but it's really overwhelmed by the number of destructions that we've seen by the Islamic State. The bar charts here on the right go back to 2014 at the top, and then they bring us to December 2016. And it shows the frequency of these deliberate destructions. Blue is Syria, orange is Iraq, and as you can see, deliberate destructions are starting to tail off. And this largely has to do with the loss of territory. As the Islamic State is losing territory, they don't have as many targets, so especially soft targets, cultural sites that are easy for them to target. They've also, in some theaters in the conflict, they've exhausted the number of targets that they have. They've simply destroyed all of the cultural sites that they could use for a performative deliberate destruction on a videotape. So the map gives you some idea of the areas that have been hardest hit in northwestern Syria, and especially the area around Mosul. So why does Islamic State do this? When I've spoken to Congress and policymakers in the United States or at the UN, try to sort of sum up what's going on, because there's a lot of misinformation or misconceptions about what the Islamic State's doing. A frequent question I get is, shouldn't we buy antiquities or bring antiquities to the West to save them from Islamic State destruction? Because Islamic State's destroying antiquities. And in reality, of course, that's not really the case. They're destroying cultural heritage sites for propagandistic purposes, for what we call performative deliberate destructions. Behind the scenes, they are stealing everything that is not nailed down in Syria and northern Iraq for sale. Cultural property, fine art, jewelry, precious metal, real estate, cars, refrigerators, everything. They will occasionally destroy antiquities on camera, rarely as a type of a smokescreen, but in reality, throughout the entire time that our project has been running, we'll find a video of Islamic State, for example, destroying antiquities, and our sources in Mosul will say they destroyed a few things off of the cameras that are too well known or are too heavy to ship. Too well known for the antiquities markets or too heavy to ship. They've been in the Mosul Museum, for example, this week, our sources would tell us, and they've stolen everything small that they could essentially sell on to Turkey. So this put us in the position over the last couple of years to try to get the word out that Islamic State is not destroying antiquities, they're selling them, and people should not buy them. We should not buy them to try to save them. Obviously, if you're buying an antiquity in the West, Islamic State gets its money before any antiquity leaves Syria or Iraq. So you're not saving anything. All you're doing is contributing to the international antiquities market or the black market. So I call this the dual exploitive doctrine. They promote their radical ideology through the destruction of cultural sites, and they fund their operations essentially through the liquidation of the cultural patrimony of Iraq and Syria. And it serves their purpose to erase cultural memory, manipulate cultural identity, and essentially destroy cultural diversity. Here we have a young Islamic State fighter that has appeared in multiple videos and pictures. He is from Sweden. I cannot give you his identity, but he is Swedish. Many of them are from Europe, the United States, Canada, who we saw engaging in Syria, engaging in the destruction of Sufi shrines. Sufism is a sect of the Sunni faith, a mystical sect of the Sunni faith, and it has saints. And there are lots of shrines dedicated to these saints and tombs. And Islamic State has destroyed the vast majority of them throughout Syria and Iraq. This is a way to target Sufism, but by targeting Sufism, Islamic State is also targeting Kurds. The Kurds are very much engaged in the Sufi faith. And so we've seen just a horrible number of these sorts of destructions. In this case, the fighter, there's an improvised explosive device on the sarcophagus of a Sufi saint. The young Swedish fighter is holding a piece of Sufi portable art that he will then stomp on and desecrate, essentially, before they blow up this shrine. I'm not going to show the video or the photographs of it, but time after time, what you see is a sequence of these photos or videos that are released online showing the destruction of these sites. And the fighters show themselves quite brazenly. We've been able to identify large numbers of them, and we hope that this will, of course, help us to prosecute them in the future for war crimes. These tapes, these photographs will be very effective a way to prosecute them, because we won't be reliant on witnesses to have to come in and testify in court. Those witnesses would, of course, be targeted for reprisals. And so they're providing us with the types of information we would need to prosecute them. And they get this idea of intentional destructions and performative, deliberate destructions of heritage places. Really, to my mind, goes back to the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, which was a widely publicized intentional destruction of two colossal Buddha sculptures in Bamiyan that by the Taliban. They got a lot of attention, I think, as many of you remember. The international community, there was a lot of warnings from the Taliban that they were planning to blow up these sculptures. There was international outrage. The international community offered to pay the local warlords in this area of Afghanistan if they would spare these sculptures, and the warlords replied quite publicly, "It's funny that you would give us money to spare these sculptures when our region has been suffering a famine for several years and no one has provided us with food aid or money for that." And then they blew up the sculptures anyway, and it was, in a certain sense, a propaganda coup for the organization. And a lot of Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters took notice of this, and we've just seen a steady escalation in these types of performative deliberate destructions. If you were to ask me, though, what is the primary reason why the Islamic State is so obsessed with this, is that they are trying to establish a brand for their jihadist organization, and they are trying to delegitimize other groups, particularly Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood. All of these different groups that are Islamist do engage in this type of cultural cleansing. Islamic State comes into an area, they blow up a Sufi shrine, they destroy a Shia mosque or some other cultural heritage. It delegitimizes the previous Islamist groups who had been in that area sometimes for years. And they can point to that and say, we are obviously the true believers here. We are uncompromising, and we are this irresistible historical force. How is it that these things still exist here if true Muslims lived here previously? It promotes their brand, and when new franchises spring up in Libya or in Sinai, they announce the establishment of that new franchise through the destruction, oftentimes, of a cultural heritage site to let everyone know that they're there and what they intend to do. You don't have to look very hard for these destructions. My staff simply goes to Islamic State's glossy English language publication, Dabiq, and they can read all about them with Islamic State text explaining why they're destroying a particular site. So we don't really have to guess oftentimes why they're doing it. We can, through intermediaries, we have actually posed questions to Islamic State leadership in places like Palmyra or in the Aleppo theater, and they talk about why they destroy sites to people that we're working with. And a lot of times, most of them blow up these cultural heritage sites. Their answers are, a particular Islamic State emir is asked, why did you blow up this particular shrine in the area of ancient Palmyra in Syria? And I will quote exactly what he said, because it gets me in the newspapers in the West. It gets me on the news, and that strengthens my position in Islamic State. They know that if they blow up an archaeological site, it plays well for them in the West. All the while, though, they're mostly targeting Christian, Muslim heritage for cultural cleansing. But they'll occasionally blow up something at Palmyra or at Nineveh or at Nimrud, knowing full well that that will essentially outrage the West and will promote their propaganda. So a typical story, after the Islamic State deliberate destruction of ancient sculptures in the Mosul Museum, there is a story out there that these sculptures in the Mosul Museum were replicas or fakes. That is not true. There were only a few casts. Most of the sculptures were ancient. After the Islamic State destroyed those sculptures, they produced a story in Dabiq called Erasing the Legacy of a Ruined Nation, in which they promote the theory that the promotion of this ancient Iraqi culture is a Western conspiracy brought by colonialists to Iraq to undermine the true faith. They argue that this should not be a part of Iraqi cultural national identity, and that they are there to prevent it from being a source of heresy or shirk in the region. So, moving from that, we've seen a lot of deliberate destructions, but at least the good news is they're on the decline. What has my organization done to try to fight back against this? Oddly enough, we collect the information and we publish it on intentional destructions as quickly as we can to preempt Islamic State's use of the information. Now that sounds a little unusual to some people because it sounds like we're doing a bit of their propaganda for them. But what we do is we try to get out a short, concise, objective account of what happened and what that cultural site was before Islamic State can use it. And we try to prevent them from using these destructions, releasing the information on a particular date. They won't just destroy a site and release the information immediately. They wait till a specific date to use the performative deliberate destruction. For example, in the city of Deir ez-Zor in Syria, Islamic State destroyed a museum to the Armenian genocide. They videotaped that, they photographed it, and then they released it on Armenian Independence Day for maximum impact in the Armenian community. They will frequently release, again, they do this with all religions, all ethnic groups. They will frequently release information on deliberate destructions when they have suffered a political or military setback to try to divert attention from political and military setbacks, as people do the world over. So what we're trying to do is at least minimize the impact there and to try to control the message and to give people accurate information as to what's happening, because a lot of really inaccurate information circulates really quickly, and once it has circulated out there on the internet, it is virtually impossible to stamp it out, I can tell you. Even when a lot of times a site has not been destroyed, there's a story it has been destroyed, and we will work for months to convince the media that the site is still standing and to be quiet about it because they're simply drawing attention to it, for example. So, airstrikes. What have we seen in terms of site types? Airstrikes have predominantly hit religious sites and monuments, 79% of the sites. And you can see here the religious affiliations, Sunni sites have been heavily targeted using barrel bombs dropped from helicopters and fixed wing aircraft. After that, other undetermined Islamic sites, we often don't know whether a particular mosque is Sunni or Shia or Sufi, and it takes us a lot of time to research it accurately. And then you can see the other religious affiliations and ancient. There has been a marked increase in the targeting of Sunni mosques in northwest Syria. There's barely a mosque still standing in much of the northern part of the country. And here you can see the targeting, again, the top of the bar chart there is August 2014. The bottom is December 2016. You can see the escalation in airstrikes. This dates back to the time of Russian involvement in the conflict. I don't know how else to put it. And the Iranians upping the amount of material, military material coming into Syria. And you can see on the map where those airstrikes have occurred. And here you can see our assessment of who's responsible for those airstrikes, including the United States, at 11%. The United States is in yellow, is the north of Syria and the Mosul area, and so on. Obviously, these will be corrected over time, but it gives you some sense of where these airstrikes are coming from. And this, again, is largely a religious sites. Skip over that one. So just to look at this in a little more detail, the situation in Iraq. The situation in Iraq is different than Syria in many ways. When Islamic State first took the city of Mosul, there was sort of a quiet for a short period of time, for a few days, but then they immediately started to target religious monuments in the city, and one of the first that they turned to is an archaeological mound. You're looking at an archaeological mound with a mosque on top of it, and that is a part of the ancient Assyrian site of Nineveh, one of the capitals of the Assyrian Empire, inside the modern city of Mosul. And that mosque is the Nebi Yunus Mosque complex, which previously was a church and also allegedly the site of a synagogue. It is the alleged burial place of the prophet Jonah. It is a holy site for many different religions, but it has an above-ground tomb structure. And so Islamic State began to pack the building with explosives, and then residents of Mosul tried to stop them. They were not successful. And the entire structure was annihilated, essentially. This is a well-known deliberate destruction. Not only did they blow up this mosque complex, but they eventually brought in large tandem trucks and earth movers. They removed all of the debris. They completely leveled the site. And then allegedly they are looking for buyers for the real estate. So it's just the complete erasure of this monument. They began to also tunnel into the archaeological mound below the Nebi Yunus Mosque complex and found a late Assyrian, a Neo-Assyrian palace complex of the first millennium BC that they then looted. And then they left these large open tunnels that threatened to cause the entire site to collapse. So this is sort of a typical scenario for the Islamic State in Iraq. They then turned on the antiquities that remained in the Mosul Museum. They filmed this and photographed it. Islamic State fighters, most of whom had Saudi Gulf Arabic accents, they were not Iraqi accents, gave speeches for the cameras and then smashed up sculptures with sledgehammers. These sculptures came from Nineveh, another Assyrian capital city, ancient Nimrud, and a site not too far west of Mosul called Hatra, which is an important Hellenistic and Roman era site out in the desert, a lot like Palmyra in Syria, that was an important early site for Arab ethnicity. These sculptures are destroyed because they're human representations, which are not acceptable to Salafists, or they show other religious iconography or animals. In some cases, they destroyed or at least defaced monumental sculptures at the site of Nineveh. This is a colossal lamassu, or winged bull, ancient sculpture that stood at one of the gates at the city of Nimrud. It has been completely destroyed. Now again, we knew that they were doing this on our project. We didn't announce it at the time. But we also knew from sources in Mosul that while they were doing this, they were stealing all the other antiquities in the Mosul Museum. There were trucks with Turkish and Jordanian license plates pulling up to take the material away. So they filmed these destructions for the cameras and for their propaganda. They also went out to the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Hatra and destroyed the Hellenistic and Roman era sculptures on the architecture. The site is too large for them to really effectively destroy all of the stone standing architecture. Where they could not reach the sculptures, they used AK-47s to just annihilate them using rapid fire. Eventually, later, they began to visit sites further out from Mosul. Again, one of the sites that they targeted for horrific destruction was the Assyrian site of Nimrud. It's the early capital city of the Assyrian Empire. It dates to the 10th, 9th century. It had a large palace that dates to the time of King Ashur-nasir-pal II in the 9th century. It was excavated by Austin Henry Layard in the mid-19th century, and sculptures were taken back to the British Museum and grace many other museums, Metropolitan Museum and the Louvre. These bas-reliefs on the upper left have, on the upper right for your side, have cuneiform inscriptions on them from Ashur-nasir-pal talking about his achievements in setting up the Assyrian Empire. We received word from the guard at this site through intermediaries that Islamic State was bringing heavy machinery there, that they were acting suspiciously at the site, but what do you do? What can you do? So we just had to wait. Satellite imagery showed that there was a lot of new limestone piles appearing outside the palace, really bright white broken up limestone. We noticed that the tops of the monumental doorways were broken out because heavy machinery was being driven into the palace. Some people said, well, could you use airstrikes to stop them? My take on it is if you were to use airstrikes to take out the people out there on the bulldozers and in the taxi cabs that were coming to do this, they would send more people, and they would film it. And they would say, look how the West is trying to stop us from doing this. But we're going to do it anyway. And they would eventually still have destroyed Nimrud and all of these other sites. And the people out there frequently who are committing these deliberate destructions are people who are being forced to do it by the Islamic State. Not all of them are Islamic State fighters. They would get the idea to just use local civilians and force them to do this kind of work. For a while, they used jackhammers and sledgehammers to destroy the bas-reliefs, but there's simply too much sculpture at Nineveh. So eventually, they packed the palace with 55-gallon drums full of fertilizer and explosives, big improvised explosive devices. They gave speeches as to why this site was inappropriate to Islam and to Iraqi nationality and as a Western conspiracy. And then in this just massive explosion, they blew the palace off the face of the earth. You can see the ziggurat, that earthen mound in the background, is an ancient stepped pyramid structure, or ziggurat. They recently bulldozed that completely away before they were driven away from the site by the Iraqi military. So they've been driven away from these sites recently, they have this scorched earth policy where they will actually stop their retreat and bulldoze cultural heritage sites just because they can, before they are forced out of an area. So Nimrud has suffered a lot of destruction. Nineveh as well. Eventually, Islamic State ran out of religious sites to destroy, so they turned to secular architecture at a lot of sites. These are the gates of Nineveh, which they have completely bulldozed away. Sources in Mosul photographed this forest from taxi cabs, and if they had been caught, they would have been killed. But it's important to the people of Mosul, to the Iraqi people, so they will risk their lives photographing and videotaping what Islamic State's doing to let people outside know that they are, obviously seriously concerned about what Islamic State is doing to their cultural heritage. You can see how Islamic State goes about doing this. They've bulldozed almost all of the gates of Nineveh. They were reconstructed in the era of Saddam Hussein, but on the original foundations using ancient sculptures. So there's a lot of ancient material that's being destroyed in this. Yeah. While they're doing all of this in Iraq and in Syria, we'll get to Syria in a moment, they're also stealing antiquities. And we reported this from the get-go. In August 2014, one of my major duties was to go out on the road and talk about cultural property crime and the looting and trafficking of antiquities for terrorist finance. And for a long time, there was a lot of pushback, particularly in the United States from the lobbyists that worked for the art market. People didn't want to believe that antiquities were being used to fund terrorism. Obviously, this might make a dent in antiquities sales. And we said, well, look, what the Islamic State did is they went into areas where people were already looting. Locals were looting to feed their families, to heat their houses in winter, to try to stay alive during the war. Islamic State just became new management for all of that and organized this crime, and then licensed people to do the looting. You're looking at an Islamic State license to loot, and then imposed a particular percentage tax in antiquities or cash. And that varies from region to region. It became so important to them in Deir ez-Zor, they had one of their head guys who's in charge of natural resources, a man named Abu Sayyaf is his Abu name, who was in charge of gas and oil sales, actually also specialized in antiquity sales because it was an important source of revenue coming out of the Euphrates River Valley of Syria. That became part of his specialty. Of course, U.S. Special Forces raided Abu Sayyaf. Abu Sayyaf died in that raid. U.S. Special Forces recovered his laptop, antiquities, and paperwork on the entire operation. And this is being done throughout Islamic State's territory. Emir after emir is engaged in this kind of operation. We know the locations of antiquities caches, their warehouses. We know who the intermediaries are, and we know the routes they're using to smuggle the material out. And there are Western dealers, allegedly, who are going into the country to buy antiquities from them. I can't tell you what it's worth to the organization, but it's important enough that high-ranking members of the organization take a direct hand in managing the antiquities trade. I could go on and on about this, but it is an important source of revenue. These are antiquities that were recovered from Abu Sayyaf. I was given declassified photos of antiquities from Abu Sayyaf's laptop and immediately made my eyes pop because I already had photographs of those antiquities because they were for sale in Turkey 6 months earlier. And you began to connect the dots, satellite imagery, sources on the ground, and these kinds of intelligence grabs, and you begin to reconstruct what is a very, very large sort of network throughout the Mediterranean region that's taking antiquities from the conflict zone and other stolen goods and people and weapons back and forth. All right. And this is a fairly typical looting job. This is not Islamic State looting. This is looting that was done by locals first, privately. Looting springs up all over, just local villagers again trying to make money. This is the site of Nineveh. Islamic State came in and organized that and brought in tunneling machines and tunneled the site of Nineveh for military purposes, to hide trucks and anti-aircraft weapons and ammunition, but also to recover antiquities from the site. Each one of those circles is a massive tunnel that you can drive a truck down into the Neo-Assyrian site of Nineveh. Now this has been liberated, so we have videos and photographs from inside the tunnels. At first I thought these tunnels were only for military purposes, but in reality, in a lot of cases, they're following the subsurface archaeological remains. And this is an Islamic State tunnel in an archaeological mound in Syria. We actually have people who have videotaped the looters working in these tunnels and have gotten the looters to talk about what they're doing. They're really brazen, they're cavalier about it. Today I'm excavating Byzantine and Roman. A lot of the looters worked on archaeological excavations previously. They're very small fish, they're trying to feed their families, and they get a few dollars for this work. Islamic State, dealers in Switzerland, London, New York, by the time they get a hold of these antiquities, it's 90 times more money that they get for them. So who do you punish, really? How do you stop this? You have to go after the Western market and the intermediaries who have one foot in organized crime and the other foot in with these terrorist organizations, and those are the people we really want to focus on. We also want to reduce the Western market for the antiquities. So the situation in Syria is a little bit different, but we do see massive looting. Looting is far worse in Syria, and it was before the war. My archaeological site would be looted at night while I was in bed. I would come back the next day in 1998 to find that someone had been digging on the site. I suspect some of them were my own workmen, but it was a part of life in Syria, and we all kind of understood it. As soon as the situation deteriorated in 2011, entire archaeological mounds that are ancient cities, like Dura Europos, Apamea, Palmyra, were being looted. They were being looted by private groups that then, were essentially under the protection of opposition or regime or Kurds. Everybody's involved in this, everyone with a shovel, all military belligerents. But when Islamic State came in, they changed things. They rented metal detectors to the looters, heavy machinery. They even paid groups of workmen, hundreds of them, to go out and loot. They have many different modes or modalities for looting. So it's different in Islamic State's case. This site was looted privately, then while the opposition had this region, and then Islamic State came in and took it over. When we look at satellite images and when we interview dealers of antiquities and when we look at what's going on, people say, well, how much did Islamic State making from this? Well, how am I supposed to know? Was an antiquity looted when it was under opposition control, under private organized crimes hands, or when Islamic State had the site? I don't know. It's so difficult to reconstruct these revenue streams for any particular belligerent. What I've seen happening recently is everything gets blamed on Islamic State, when in point of fact we know that someone else is involved. And frequently now groups are using Islamic State as the scapegoat for all cultural heritage destruction and theft, because it sticks, right? This is the site of Apamea. It's being looted by the local villagers. The Syrian opposition blames the Assad regime. The Assad regime blames the opposition. I think in this case, everybody's culpable and people are trying to feed their families. Again, it's an entire ancient Roman era site. Actually, it goes back to the Hellenistic period, but Roman era site that has just been annihilated. It would have taken hundreds of years to do this much excavation scientifically. Hundreds of years. They did it in months, to give you some idea of what's been lost. And yes, they're finding lots and lots of antiquities. I know that because we have videotapes of the looters working. They dig very scientifically. They actually use trowels and picks, and oftentimes they, not in this case, but they maintain bulks. You can tell they've been trained. We know that there are people with training. And then they go through the trench periodically with metal detectors, because what they're really after are coins and other metal objects, but coins in particular, because a coin from Syria can be marketed in Germany or elsewhere as a coin from the Eastern Mediterranean. And one ancient tetradrachma looks like another tetradrachma, right? So they're easy to launder into the legitimate market. We're seeing a lot of looting of small expensive items that they can easily launder. And that's what's hitting the market now. Sculptures, mosaics, architectural spolia are on the market, but they're being cached. They go to Turkey or Lebanon, and then they're being warehoused away so that they can be sold 10 or 15 years from now when people forget. But coins and a lot of other objects are for sale. All you have to do is go out and look on the internet. People are doing sort of do-it-yourself Facebook sites where you can see all of this stuff for sale. And there's just been a massive spike in coins from Syria into Iraq on the market, and a lot of religious paraphernalia. But I could show you lots of fakes on the market, lots of legitimate items. I have documented thousands of antiquities coming out of Syria and Iraq at this point. Actually, I stopped doing this about 6 months ago because there's just so much. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Got a little bit of time. In Syria, we've also seen a much higher rate of damage in urban environments. And probably the best example of the horrible toll that the Syrian conflict has had on cultural heritage is the city of Aleppo. At the center of Aleppo, you're looking at a digital globe, high-resolution satellite of the center of Aleppo. At the center of Aleppo, this was my favorite place to go and have coffee and tea. I used to go here regularly for our excavation to go shopping in the covered market or souk. I'd go to the blacksmith to get archaeological picks. We'd buy tents and rope or mattresses, whatever the excavation needed. I'd hop in the truck, go an hour and a half to the souk, and we'd buy it in Aleppo. And then I could wander around the citadel. That's that mound that you see there. That's the Acropolis of ancient Aleppo. It's an archaeological mound that's 30, 40 meters high, on top of which there is an anti-Crusader castle from the Crusader period. Fabulous, fabulously well-preserved castle. There was a German excavation down into that mound that seemed like they were digging forever. They went down tens of meters deep. It got really dangerous. And the German excavators only reached the early Iron Age. This mound goes back probably at least to 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 BC. Surrounding it, there's a lower mound that you can't see because the modern city of Aleppo is on top of it, but that's all a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The citadel is surrounded by what was this incredibly well-preserved early modern, medieval early modern architecture. Things that were Mameluke, Ottoman period, madrasas or Islamic schools, mosques, Sufi shrines. It was absolutely gorgeous. Just incredible architecture, narrow winding streets, the covered market. I mean, it was just fabulous. And then the souk was burned in the early days of the Syrian uprising. The souk caught fire. It's gone. Unfortunately for the Aleppo citadel, it was the epicenter of the fight. The regime controlled the citadel and the route up to it, but the opposition had the immediate territory to the west. Okay? And so the regime was using the citadel as a fortified fighting position against the opposition. As things got rough, the regime began to bring in airstrikes to try to root out the opposition that was in the UNESCO World Heritage Site. The opposition responded by tunneling, sometimes hundreds of meters, from their positions under the Assad regime's military positions, packing the tunnels full of explosives and then detonating them in what were quite intentional destructions. Both sides are deliberately targeting heritage. And the UNESCO World Heritage Site, you can see on where the red arrows are, those are all massive craters about the size of a city block where there was a very significant Islamic structure that frequently was 400 or 500 years old. They are completely gone. They were blown into the air by the tunnel bombs. And then the debris rained down on all of the surrounding architecture, and the detonation shook all of the surrounding architecture. So there's still a lot of standing architecture, but it will probably have to be demolished. I can't tell you what's going to happen to the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Aleppo, how much money it's going to cost, and how long it will take to put back together. But it reminds me of northern Italy, Poland, Germany, France after World War II, where I was just recently in Dresden. They're still putting Dresden back together in a highly controversial, sometimes, process. This is the damage to the Aleppo citadel caused by rooting out a sniper. There was a regime sniper in the Aleppo citadel, and the opposition used heavy explosives to root him out and took out a section of the wall. I'm going to skip over some material. This is a barrel bomb on a historic cemetery in Aleppo. Cemeteries are frequently in the line of fire. All sides deliberately target them. This is what Aleppo looks like today. I apologize for the low resolution images. They're not coming through, but I don't recognize the street scenes of Aleppo anymore. I was there for 20 years. I don't know what I'm looking at, and it's just right downtown. I should know these intersections around the citadel, and to me, they're just massive piles of debris. This is right in the area of the citadel. You can see the citadel in the background here. The destroyed, that's the Al-Trush Mosque, the minaret's gone. Just this one building would take years to put back together. This is a late Ottoman period mosque. And that's what the Aleppo citadel looks like today. That was in the foreground of that image. There was a coffee shop where I used to take my students to get coffee when we toured the Aleppo citadel. Now it's just a massive pile of concrete and limestone debris. In the Aleppo countryside, airstrikes have taken a terrible toll on sites, and I thought I would throw in an early Christian site to give you some idea of what's being lost, let's say, for Christian monuments. Syria, Western Syria, the northwest, has an area that we call the Dead Cities region, which is a vast park out in the countryside. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site where you drive out into it and it's rolling green hills and olive groves and shepherds with sheep and goats. And you look out and you see what look like villages, but then you realize they're ruins that are standing up to roof level. These are the dead cities from the Byzantine period. Just incredible landscape. That area has many early monasteries and Christian churches, just an incredibly well-preserved early Christian landscape. And unfortunately, as people have fled Aleppo and other cities, refugees have sought shelter in the subterranean spaces and in the standing architecture of the Dead Cities region. They are modifying the buildings, and in some cases they're tearing them down to build new buildings. Their presence has brought military units into the area who use them as training bases and who live there as well. That's brought airstrikes. And one of the sites that's been hit by regime and Russian airstrikes is the early Christian church of St. Simeon, where Simeon the Stylite famously sat on top of a column. That's the remains of that column. And that was targeted for an airstrike because the church was being used as a base by Jabhat al-Nusra or Liwa Tawhid or some other Islamist group. And that's what the column of St. Simeon looks like today in the church. And it's been hit repeatedly by rockets and mortar fire. And there's just this back and forth. Why did you target this? Because terrorist fighters are using it as a base. And that's what we read in the social media, accusation after accusation. But no site has suffered as much as Palmyra. I will move through Palmyra as quickly as I can, but bear in mind that it has been largely destroyed because of the Islamic State's occupations of the site. At first, the site was militarized by the Syrian regime, and there was a lot of fighting between the opposition in Syria and the Syrian regime. And that caused some damage and looting. But then the Islamic State captured the site, and that just unleashed a massive wave of destruction. They were then pushed out by Russian and Syrian forces. And there was much celebrating. And people spoke about the repair of Palmyra, that we would reconstruct the site. And there was a concert put on by a Russian symphony in the Roman theater of Palmyra, and then Islamic State came back. And I'll talk about both of these episodes, but then Islamic State was eventually driven out again. But there were two episodes. A lot of destruction. It's a very famous city of the Roman era. It was an important caravan center for the silk and spice trade in the Roman era, and a very affluent, multicultural city in antiquity. Many religions, many different languages. We know a lot about ancient Palmyra. Famous tombs, subterranean tombs and above-ground tombs. Incredibly well-preserved theaters and temples. It's also a modern town called Tadmor, which has 40,000 people, 50,000 people. Many refugees in the early years of the Syrian conflict sought refuge in the desert at Tadmor because it seemed like a safe place. So the real tragedy, and I have to point this out, has been the fate of the people of Tadmor. What has happened to the ancient remains is sad. But again, I never lose track, and I think no one should ever lose track of what has happened in terms of the humanitarian crisis here to the people of Tadmor. And Islamic State is just as much behind this as the Assad regime and the Syrian opposition. When Islamic State first came into Palmyra and Tadmor, they didn't target the Roman remains of the great city of Queen Zenobia. Palmyra is famous because it led a successful rebellion in the Roman era against the Roman Empire. its queen, Zenobia, actually managed to assert her independence and for a time ruled over an empire from Turkey to Egypt, but it was very violently put down by the Romans. When Islamic State came in, they didn't focus on the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Palmyra. They immediately destroyed Sufi shrines in Tadmor. They destroyed a mosque, a Shia shrine and mosque out in the countryside of Palmyra that dates back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad. While they were under fire, their fighters did this. That's how important it was, the cultural cleansing dimension. They forced people to destroy graves in the cemeteries of Tadmor. These are people convicted of minor crimes. They have to destroy the graves of their ancestors. These are more modern graves because they're above ground grave structures. They destroyed an important Christian monastery that dates back to the Byzantine period. The monastery of Mar Elion, or St. Julian, which had burials of Byzantine patriarchs going back into the Byzantine period. Islamic State bulldozed it, the site, and then they opened the graves and they desecrated them and looted things from the graves. They frequently will, I try not to show too many of these photographs, but there's a lot of this exhumation and desecration of graves throughout Syria and Iraq. And then they turned on the ancient site. And we knew this was going to happen because our sources in Tadmor told us. Islamic State today drove their pickups into Tadmor, and their fighters announced on loudspeakers that they were planting explosives in the monuments of Palmyra. And they sent us a map of where the explosives were. What do you do? I mean, it's excruciating. But we knew that they had mined the site, and then they waited. And then they began to deliberately destroy the major, most significant monuments at the site as though they were working their way through the attributes of outstanding universal value of the UNESCO World Heritage Site nomination. They started with a really well-preserved small temple, the Temple of Baal-Shaman, that combined Greco-Roman, Egyptian, and Persian architectural elements. My favorite structure because it had a little tree inside of it. They blew it sky high. They then loaded 60 tons of explosives into the major ancient temple of Palmyra, the Temple of Baal, the Lord, which was a Greco-Roman period temple to the main patron deity of Palmyra that became a Christian church and was later converted to a mosque. Incredible history, religious history, incredibly well-preserved site. And they blew it to pieces, as is fairly well known at this point. The doorway is still standing in one column there in the photograph. And here you can see a before and after of what the site looks like today. It's quite a jigsaw puzzle. They then began to destroy the famous tower tombs of Palmyra. Many of these have subterranean labyrinthine tombs below that have lots of sculpture inside of them. And there's sculptures inside the towers as well. They went to the most significant, well-preserved tower tombs and blew them up. But then they also looted, they dug around them. So they destroy the well-known sculptures inside the tombs, and then they dig for new sculptures that are not known on the market. Totally verified. For a while, they spared the Roman theater, and instead of attacking the tangible physical elements of it, Islamic State child fighters, boys, marched regime prisoners into the theater and then executed them on camera. The people of Tadmor, many people from Tadmor were forced to sit in the theater and watch this mass execution. That is an attack on the intangible symbolic dimension of heritage. Obviously, it's a horrific human atrocity, but when I look at the Palmyra Theater now, that's what I think of. I used to think of how my students stood on that stage for their end-of-season photograph when we toured Syria after my archaeological excavation. I will never look at the site that way again. All heritage has this intangible dimension that makes it special. That's what makes the Roman theater. It was special because it was there when, in the time of Zenobia or slightly thereafter. I like to think that, people from the Roman Empire sat there and watched plays. Would a reconstruction of that be the same? Well, there's this intangible dimension. Islamic State, it's a really heinous type of crime, has engaged in a lot of executions using cultural heritage sites. I'm not going to go into the gory details, but they've done this everywhere, and it's been quite frequent. They killed many archaeologists in Syria and Iraq. Some of them working for my program in Mosul have been killed. One of the most high-profile cases was the execution of Qalaat al-Assad. There are a lot of different stories as to why Qalaat was killed, but the simple fact is he was killed by Islamic State, very brutally murdered. But again, at least 14 archaeologists in Syria and several in Mosul have died. The cultural sector has not been spared. They have systematically disassembled the cultural and educational sectors throughout their territories. The Palmyra Museum was converted into an Islamic court because they thought that it would prevent airstrikes. They were wrong. And it was targeted for airstrikes because it was being used as a Sharia court. And this is what, after the first liberation of Palmyra, the museum looked like. Horrific condition. There were stories that most of the antiquities had been evacuated to Damascus, but in reality, a large number of the antiquities were not evacuated. Islamic State deliberately destroyed the antiquities that were left behind and stole a lot of them too. You can see that they defaced a lot of funerary sculptures from the tombs of Palmyra that were attached to the walls and couldn't be evacuated. A lot of this defacing of sculpture. And finally, Palmyra also has a medieval era castle that overlooks the site, and that was militarized by the Syrian regime, Islamic State, and others, and it has suffered heavily from airstrikes and military damage. Islamic State seems to be it seems to be on the wane. I don't think we're going to have as much trouble with Islamic State now. I hope, inshallah. We hope. But what seems to be the biggest problem now, to my mind, and what we've been documenting over the last 6 months, has been the militarization of cultural heritage sites. And then after that, the targeting of those sites. And that's probably the biggest problem that we face now, is that cultural heritage sites are heavily militarized by all sides in the conflict. And of course, this goes against a lot of international law, but it's happening. A lot like this. Now, the final chapter recently for Palmyra has been when Islamic State did come back in. There was a lot of retributory violence against the people of Tadmor who had cooperated with the Russians and the regime. They then went to Palmyra and they destroyed a lot of monuments. And they were monuments that had gotten a lot of press coverage when the Russians and the regime were there, and especially the theater. The theater had been the site of a Russian concert. Islamic State went to the theater and they blew up the stage. Now remember, it's a secular monument. It's not a religious monument. There's nothing in Salafist ideology that says that they should do that. And we've seen this in Iraq as well. What Islamic State has done now that they've run out of religious targets, is they've returned now to just flat-out revenge destructions and retributory violence. They also try to target Shia and other religious groups' heritage to try to foment sectarian violence between Sunni, Alawi, and Shia and Sufi, to try to keep the conflict going, because they feed on conflict as an organization. Well, thank you for your attention. Hopefully I'll just wrap up by saying that we have a lot of different organizations that work with our project. We are between 70 and 100 people when we are fully funded, which we are not right now. I will point out my funding should have come January 1st, and we are on hold at the U.S. State Department. You can put together, you can make whatever you want of that. I'm hoping that our program will be continued. But the real heroes in all of this are the people of Syria and Iraq that work with our project, whether they're with the Syrian regime, the Iraqi government, Syrian opposition. All sides in the conflict, except Islamic State, have people who are risking their lives to preserve their cultural heritage. The Directorate General of Antiquities and Museums within the Syrian regime, their people risk their lives daily to save heritage. People of Mosul, people within the opposition, within Kurdish paramilitary. Without those local stakeholders, we could do nothing on the ground, and we are achieving positive results on the ground. Islamic State, on the other hand, to my mind, is the absolute antithesis of cultural property protection. And why is that a problem? What will Syrian refugees go home to if their houses, their mosques, their churches, their cemeteries, their villages and towns have been completely annihilated? When all trace, cultural memory, identity, diversity has been wiped out. Who will want to go back? How will we establish, how will the international community establish and maintain a lasting peace? when it's so easy to foment sectarian violence. And remember that this problem is spreading. It is not confined to Syria and Iraq at all, as we are reminded almost on a weekly basis. This problem is spreading fairly rapidly. I think that we've turned a corner recently, but we have a very, very long way to go. Thank you for your attention.
I want to thank everyone very much for coming today. This was a fascinating lecture, and we're very lucky to have you here today to tell us about this. I'm going to open up the floor to questions. If I'll get the ball rolling, I guess, if we don't, to give you guys time to think about your own questions. But my question to you is, where are we seeing, you were talking about looting of artifacts, and where are we seeing the largest amount of illegal antiquities being bought up? And are we seeing these making their way into reputable auction houses in the West?
Sure. So obviously, auction houses are being very carefully monitored in private galleries. We're not seeing antiquities cropping up at those sites. I mean, plain and simple. What's going on is they're using digital photography in the internet to set up sites where they can show the antiquities to potential buyers. And then intermediaries in Europe and the United States can then meet with potential buyers or talk to them on the phone. And then the antiquities are put in DHL or FedEx envelopes and mailed from Turkey and Lebanon. The larger items and the more valuable items we suspect are being cached in places like Turkey, Bulgaria. The free port system may be in Switzerland, not to point any fingers, but there are free ports where art and antiquities can be held in absolute private in a tax-free environment indefinitely. And like in past illicit art cases, we find that these free ports serve a purpose there. If you're interested in this phenomenon, read the Medici conspiracy. There's a book out about this that's quite good, about how the free port system has been used for illicit art and antiquities. We suspect this is going on again. I'm seeing lots of middle tier and lower tier value antiquities for sale. I've had them offered to me to buy. I've had people in Syria send them to me to authenticate and put values on them because they don't understand what I actually do for a living. It's just a little embarrassing, but it's all over the place. As soon as we find these websites, we grab up all of the information and they're shut down. But it's a race for my project to get the information before the sites are shut down by eBay or by Facebook. Kind of strange that we're racing to do that, but it's just a do-it-yourself market. Now, there have been a lot of seizures of antiquities in Turkey and Lebanon. Turkish and Lebanese authorities are doing all that they can to crack down on this, as are especially Bulgaria. But they've got a lot of other things to deal with too, with the refugee crisis and all the other things that are happening. We don't want antiquities to slip through the cracks, though, and so we always emphasize that they are an important revenue stream for the organization.
So you mentioned reconstruction, and I was wondering, for the, how does the word, for the little temples, the small ones, for the saints.
Yeah, shrines, mazar. Yeah.
Yes, shrines, yes, that's the word. I'm assuming they had reliquaries there, and that's what made them important. So if the relic's destroyed, is there still hope to rebuild the shrine, or?
Usually there's a burial of a saint, and then there are lots of other objects there, which was considered shirk under Salafism. And so they usually detonate Sufi shrines and other types of shrines with explosives, and then they usually totally demolish the site itself. So they take everything away, and then in a lot of cases they sell the real estate. They try to privately sell the real estate. They've been doing this in Mosul and a lot of other places. And so, yes, I think that the local communities will hopefully, when they return, in most cases they've left, they'll be able to reestablish these sites. But the scale of it is what really frightens me in terms of what will need to be done. And I think that the first step, obviously the leading edge of all of this is the humanitarian dimension. But it's interesting, when we talk to refugees in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon, they talk about these crimes, but they always emphasize what Islamic State or Jabhat al-Nusra did in their village to local heritage sites. They'll talk about the Islamic State coming in and taking young girls away from, let's say, the Yazidi community. But then in those conversations, they also talk about the destruction of Yazidi shrines. It's important to the local people. And they want to see something done to the perpetrators of these crimes. But we're talking about, in terms of deliberate destructions, if I had to estimate the total number, 500 or 600 of these destructions. I mean, 3 prosecutions would be almost a landmark in cultural property prosecution. In the former Yugoslavia, where there were, what, 3 prosecutions for the deliberate destruction of heritage. And recently we had 1 in Mali for the destruction of manuscripts and shrines at Timbuktu. What's the so-called Mahdi case? That's not a lot of prosecutions relative to the number of crimes that we've seen. But I think that it is quintessential that people are brought to justice for these crimes.
Kathy?
We were all heartened by the decision by the International Criminal Court in Timbuktu. Do you think that the court is capable of dealing with destruction on a scale like this?
I have serious doubts, and I got to talk to the prosecutor from the Mahdi case when I was in The Hague recently, and posed the same question, and the answer was no. I mean, I think, not to like put him on record, but I mean, obviously the scale of this is very different from what happened in Timbuktu, and the International Criminal Court in this particular instance won't have jurisdiction. So again, there would have to be what I'm hoping will happen is that the United Nations will set up a special tribunal, the way that they did they've done previously for both Syria and Iraq to try to prosecute some of these cases, and that we're collecting evidence for that. But again, there's so many different other areas of crime that they'll be prosecuting as well, especially abduction, kidnapping for ransom, and according to former Secretary Kerry, genocide against these Yazidi community. So I honestly don't know. I would be surprised if there were five cases, maybe, to put a number on it.
I'm wondering, as things hopefully start to calm down and people are able to come back into their communities, how will archaeologists, or is there a way archaeologists can work with communities that have been forced to destroy their own heritage, and how do we reconcile that tragedy for them?
Right, yeah. And we are working with them now in areas that are not controlled by the Islamic State, or so-called Islamic State. Where they are at, we can't do anything, obviously. My project has worked in Apamea, which I showed, and at the Apamea Museum, and the area around Aleppo, and at Basra al-Shem in the south of Syria. We've been able to do all sorts of projects on the ground with local stakeholders, local antiquities professionals. And what our project has done is we provide them with support to engage in cultural property protection, preservation, risk and damage mitigation projects, but we let them set the priorities for the work that they're doing. We're not saying you need to be trained. We're not trying to just do simple capacity building. We're trying to provide them with everything that they need to do their jobs. And then what we find is we get sustainable results. And we're also supporting a lot of people, providing electricians, carpenters, bomb disposal units, you name it, with funds. We've had to, and it requires sometimes just a few $100s because they need an electrical generator to charge their equipment or a laptop. It's really simple sorts of assistance. In Basra al-Shem, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is outside of Syrian regime control, we worked with the local Antiquities Authority there and supported them for 6 months to do monitoring of the heritage sites, to combat antiquities looting, and to repair the famous Umayyad Mosque at Basra al-Shem. But again, they set the priorities, they decide how to do it and what to do, and I think that's the best thing that we can do right now. But if we don't do that, why is it important? I'm not obsessed with old buildings or stones and bones as an archaeologist. We need to support the cultural sector. Along with all the rest of all the other sectors. If the cultural sector is destroyed and the tourist sector, what will Syria and Iraq be like post-conflict? It's a large part of the economy. It's practical nuts and bolts type of work. And again, just moving away from the cultural identity issue and cultural cleansing, it's also very important to the economics of the region. But the educational initiatives are being implemented in Western Syria, where Syrian cultural heritage experts are doing educational programs with refugee children, very traumatized children, to talk to them about what they've seen, to work through a lot of the trauma, but also to do cultural heritage education with them, because they've seen a world in which cultural heritage is liquidated all around them, and to try to sort of provide them with a different perspective while they're young, because we have an entire generation of Syrians and Iraqis that know nothing, young ones who know nothing but this conflict. So that's another big concern. Anyway.
This reminds me a lot of what happened in post-occupied Europe when the war was ending. The Nazis were able to steal what they had stolen during the occupation. I mean, thousands and thousands of works of art. Some were returned, but a great many ended up in private collections, even some in museums. And it set a terrible precedent because very few people were punished for that.
Yeah, if you're interested in that topic, which we look at it all the time, is the Holocaust Art Restitution Project. HARP on Facebook. You can see it's a very interesting Facebook site that talks about the efforts to try to return, to repatriate a lot of the art that was stolen, particularly from Jewish families in Western Europe. And it's not easy. A lot of that art made its way into major museums and is on their asset sheets, and they really do drag their feet about returning it. And this happens all the time. People ask me, shouldn't we have safe havens for things that are from Syria and Iraq so that we can keep them safe in museums in the West until we can give them back? And I say, that really worked out well after World War II. What could possibly go wrong? Which institutions? Where? What gives those institutions the right to do it? And who do we return the stuff to if we don't like what happens in terms of the politics of the post-conflict period? You could easily make the argument, I can hear museum directors doing it now, well, we don't feel that these things would be safe going back to this particular country, this particular group of people. We'll just keep it safe here for a long time. So, I mean, yes, it supports I do kind of like the idea of the encyclopedic museum where you can travel in the West anyway and see all these different time periods and cultures, but I believe in the idea when I see important cultural property from the United States traveling to other parts of the world. So it's like a two-way street, because so far it pretty much flowed along colonial lines as far as I can tell.
Franco.
Well, just a footnote to that, you don't even have to go to the West. You think of museums in the Arabian Peninsula. I think of the Louvre in Abu Dhabi right now, which is trying to...
And I think that's probably, yeah, there was recently. Yeah, there was a conference in Abu Dhabi that we all went to where they raised this, and there was really some pretty vicious arguments about the safe haven idea, but I think that was the compromise that was agreed upon was that in the Abu Dhabi Accord, and I think that most people were happy with that. There does have to be a place for these orphans, these objects that have been orphaned, but I would be concerned if they left the region and went too far. Yeah.
Alex.
Just thinking on this topic, first off, thank you so much for your important work.
Thank you.
Through your talk, you're talking about the West's obsession with ancient secular culture and how that's been exploited by ISIS. And so I was thinking, unfortunately, it also plays into the rhetoric that the West is better prepared to preserve antiquity, which then, of course, itself is an imperialist impulse that feeds into ISIS ideology about the West trying to control the East, right? And so you've spoken about not buying antiquities to save them, but I was just wondering, and you talked a little bit about the rhetoric, but how does it affect your department's work in trying to preserve and trying to create a kind of rhetoric around preserving ancient culture and getting that kind of West-East buying?
What can we do about it?
Yeah.
Well, in terms of the market. So unlike other major criminal revenue streams worldwide that transnational criminal organizations operate on, so weapons, drugs, and human trafficking, right? Weapons, drugs, human trafficking, what's next? Art. Sometimes art's number 5. There's a legal market for it, right? So there's this gray market that we all know about. So that's the tough part of it, is how do we address antiquities trafficking without shutting down legitimate art dealing. There are absolutists out there would say no antiquities at all. All of it needs to be banned. I'm not one of those people. I worked in a museum for a long time. I mean, I understand that people like to collect things. I collect coins, just not ancient ones. I collect wheat pennies in the United States. But people like to collect things. I understand that. Most museums have purchased antiquities and still do in a lot of cases, and antiquities with some thin provenance. So what should we do to... There's new legislation in the United States to try to crack down on the antiquities trade. The first step is there needs to be better due diligence, and we need to see more robust provenance for items that are coming onto the market. If I read one more Palmyrene funerary sculpture that's for sale in, I don't know, Michigan, that says from an old European collection in 1930, and that's the sum extent of its provenance, I'm going to scream. I mean, that is usually all you get. Now I can, wow, look, behold, right now there are lots of Palmyrene funerary sculptures for sale all of a sudden, and it's as if they are just reproducing in drawers in museums or antiquities shops, coins just springing up from the ground. Where's it all coming from? In the United States, there have been massive increases in legitimate imports of antiquities from Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. Egypt went up 600% with the conflict. Syria, 300%. Those are the declared imports of antiques from that part of the world, and no one really checked to see what those items were. There's all of this information that all this material is headed to the West, right? We know it is. And some of it's being seized. What can we do? Again, due diligence. We need high-profile prosecutions. Some really rich person needs to get caught with antiquities that are the holy grail of my work right now, which is something I know that I have documented that was looted by Islamic State. By Islamic State, not their intermediaries, by Islamic State. We have that information, and we are just waiting for it to show up in the right place, and I can't wait.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes?
I guess your last answer kind of alluded to my question is what gives you hope? It's so sad to see these fabulous things no longer on our planet. So how do you get up and go through it every day?
It increasingly has been really difficult. We have a very high turnover rate on our project. It's a very strange world. I was trained as an anthropologist. I now work as a State Department contractor, and it's very strange being in this sort of in-between. The last thing we would like to be called are monuments men, although I like to think George Clooney will play me in the movie. I mean, that's the sort of happy side of it. The strange side of it is that I work at home, in my home office, and I will be talking to people in the conflict zone, and you can hear explosions, and that's part of my world, and my children are arguing over what channel to watch on television in the next room. And that is a mind scramble that I cannot describe sometimes. So, but the way I deal with it is that my sister is a nurse in an Alzheimer's ward. My mother was an emergency medical technician. My father was a police officer and a veteran. And I know lots of firefighters. Lots of people have what I think are jobs where they go to work and then they come home. And I've just had to learn to do that. And that's very different than, well, sometimes it's different than when I was in academia. Purely in academia. But it's hard sometimes because it's all right there on the internet or on my cell phone. It never goes away.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
I just want to thank you again, Dr. Michael Danti, for a fantastic lecture. I think we all, given the questions, were incredibly intrigued and overwhelmed at times by the extent of the destruction. But thank you so much for sharing that with us. I want to thank everyone for coming to the very first annual McWhinney lecture. And I want to thank, again, our sponsors, which is the Department of Hellenic, or the Center for Hellenic Studies, the School of Resource and Environmental Management, and the Department of Archaeology at Simon Fraser. And wouldn't be complete without actually saying a very big thank you to Chris Dickert for everything that he's done to put this together. Now I'd like to invite you all to join us for a reception in the Founders Hall, where you can continue to ask Michael Danti any questions that you might have and enjoy some refreshments and food with us. Thank you all for coming.